Black Ships Before Troy. The Story of the Iliad. Myth by Rosemary Sutcliffe. The Golden Apple. In the high and far-off days when men were heroes and walked with the gods, Peleus, king of the Myrmidons, took for his wife a sea-nymph called Thetis, Thetis of the silver feet. Many guests came to their wedding feast, and among the mortal guests came all the gods of high Olympus. But as they sat feasting, one who had not been invited was suddenly in their midst. Eris, the goddess of discord, had been left out because wherever she went, she took trouble with her. Yet here she was, all the same, and in her blackest mood, to avenge the insult.
So, long story short, Peleus and Thetis got married and everybody was invited. All of the gods and the goddesses came, everyone except for Eris. Now, Eris was the goddess of discord, so she wasn't very happy about this.
All she did, it seemed a small thing, was to toss down on the table a golden apple. Then she breathed upon the guests once and vanished. The apple lay gleaming among the piled fruits and the brimming wine cups, and bending close to look at it, everyone could see the words, "To the fairest," traced on its side. Then the three greatest of the goddesses each claimed that it was hers. Hera claimed it as wife to Zeus, the All-Father, and queen of all the gods. Athene claimed that she had the better right, for the beauty of wisdom such as hers surpassed all else. Aphrodite only smiled, and asked who had a better claim to beauty's prize than the goddess of beauty herself. They fell to arguing among themselves. The argument became a quarrel, and the quarrel grew more and more bitter, and each called upon the assembled guests to judge between them. But the other guests refused, for they knew well enough that, whichever goddess they chose to receive the golden apple, they would make enemies of the other two.
So since Eris was mad that she didn't get invited to the wedding, she decided to throw down an apple that said "to the fairest," knowing good and well that the three greatest goddesses would get in an argument over who it belonged to. First, there was Hera, and Hera claimed that she should have the apple because she was the wife of Zeus. Then Athena claimed that she should have the apple because her beauty and wisdom was better than everyone else's. Aphrodite wanted the apple because she claimed that she deserved it since she was the goddess of beauty.
And the three took the quarrel home with them to Olympus. The other gods took sides, some with one and some with another, and the ill will between them dragged on for a long while. More than long enough in the world of men for a child born when the quarrel first began to grow to manhood and become a warrior or a herdsman. But the immortal gods do not know time as mortals know it. Now on the northeast coast of the Aegean Sea there was a city of men. Troy was its name, a great city surrounded by strong walls, and standing on a hill hard by the shore. It had grown rich on the tolls that its kings demanded from merchant ships, passing up the nearby straits to the Black Sea cornlands and down again. Priam, who was now king, was lord of wide realms and long-maned horses, and he had many sons about his hearth. And when the quarrel about the golden apple was still raw and new, a last son was born to him and his wife Queen Hecuba, and they called him Paris. There should have been great rejoicing, but while Hecuba still carried the babe within her, the soothsayers had foretold that she would give birth to a firebrand that should burn down Troy.
So the three goddesses fought for years and years and years and years. Meanwhile, in the human world, over in the city of Troy, King Priam and Queen Hecuba gave birth to a baby named Paris, who was a firebrand, and a soothsayer, which was a fortune teller, predicted that he was going to burn down the whole city of Troy. A firebrand is a person who creates trouble or leads to a revolt. So you can imagine back in this time that the king and queen weren't very happy about this.
And so, when he was born and named, the king bade a servant carry him out into the wilderness and leave him to die. The servant did as he was bid, but a herdsman searching for a missing calf found the babe and brought him up as his own. The boy grew tall and strong and beautiful. the swiftest runner, and the best archer in all the country around. So his boyhood passed among the oak woods and the high hill pastures that rose toward Mount Ida. And there he met and fell in love with a wood nymph called Oenone, who loved him in return. She had the gift of being able to heal the wounds of mortal men, no matter how sorely they were hurt. Among the oak woods they lived together and were happy, until one day the three jealous goddesses, still quarreling about the golden apple, chanced to look down from Olympus and saw the beautiful young man herding his cattle on the slopes of Mount Ida. They knew, for the gods know all things, that he was the son of Priam, king of Troy, though he himself did not know it yet. But the thought came to them that he would not know who they were, and therefore he would not be afraid to judge between them. They were growing somewhat weary of the argument by then. So they tossed the apple down to him, and Paris put up his hands and caught it. After it the three came down, landing before him so lightly that their feet did not bend the mountain grasses, and bade him choose between them which was the fairest and had best right to the prize he held in his hand. First Athene, in her gleaming armor, fixed him with sword-gray eyes, and promised him supreme wisdom if he would name her. Then Hera, in her royal robes as queen of heaven, promised him vast wealth and power and honor if he awarded her the prize. Lastly, Aphrodite drew near, her eyes as blue as deep sea water, her hair like spun gold wreathed around her head, and smiling honey-sweet, whispered that she would give him a wife as fair as herself if he tossed the apple to her.
So let's recap. As any good parent would when they find out their kid is going to burn down the city, they left him in the woods to die. He was rescued and grew up in the woods where he married the most beautiful woman, Oenone. So then one day the three goddesses were arguing still over who was the fairest of all when they saw Paris, and they were like, hey, this guy's a prince. He doesn't know he's a prince, so let's ask him who's the fairest of all.
And Paris forgot the other two with their offers of wisdom and power, forgot also, for that moment, dark-haired Oenone in the shadowed oak woods, and he gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. Then Athene and Hera were angry with him for refusing them the prize, just as the wedding guests had known that they would be, and both of them were angry with Aphrodite. But Aphrodite was well content, and set about keeping her promise to the herdsman who was a king's son. She put a certain thought into the heads of some of King Priam's men, so that they came cattle raiding at the full of the moon, and drove off Paris's big beautiful herd bull, who was lord of all his cattle. Then Paris left the hills and came down into Troy, seeking his bull. And there Hecuba, his mother, chanced to see him, and knew by his likeness to his brothers, and by something in her own heart, that he was the son she had thought dead and lost to her in his babyhood.
So Paris ended up siding with Aphrodite because she promised him a hot wife, and he forgot all about the other two and all about poor Oenone. He already forgot about his wifey. And then Aphrodite did something weird, and she let his bull escape, and so he had to go down to the city of Troy to find his bull, where his mom saw him, and she was like, "Oh, my baby!"
She wept for joy and brought him before the king. And seeing him living and so good to look upon, all men forgot the prophecy. And Priam welcomed him into the family and gave him a house of his own, like each of the other Trojan princes. There he lived whenever he would, but at other times he would be away back to the oak woods of Mount Ida, to his love, Oenone. And so things went on happily enough for a while. But meantime, across the Aegean Sea, another wedding had taken place. The marriage of King Menelaus of Sparta to the Princess Helen, whom men called Helen of the fair cheeks, the most beautiful of all mortal women. Her beauty was famous throughout the kingdoms of Greece, and many kings and princes had wished to marry her, among them Odysseus, whose kingdom was the rocky island of Ithaca. Her father would have none of them, but gave her to Menelaus. Yet, because he feared trouble between her suitors at a later time, he caused them all to swear that they would stand with her husband for her sake, if ever he had need of them. And between Helen and Odysseus, who married her cousin Penelope and loved her well, there was a lasting friendship that stood her in good stead when she had sore need of a friend years afterward. Even beyond the farthest bounds of Greece, the fame of Helen's beauty traveled, until it came at last to Troy, as Aphrodite had known that it would. And Paris no sooner heard of her than he determined to go and see for himself if she was indeed as fair as men said. Oenone wept and begged him to stay with her, but he paid no heed, and his feet came no more up the track to her woodland cave. If Paris wanted a thing, then he must have it. So he begged a ship from his father, and he and his companions set out. All the length of the Aegean Sea was before them, and the winds blew them often from their true course. But they came at last to their landfall, and ran the ship up the beach, and climbed the long hill tracks that brought them to the fortress palace of King Menelaus.
So meanwhile, across the sea, there was another wedding between King Menelaus and Princess Helen, who was supposedly the most beautiful woman in all of the whole world. So Paris, eventually hearing that she was the most beautiful woman in all the world, was like, I must sail over there and see her because I was promised the most beautiful wife by Aphrodite.
Slaves met them, as they met all strangers, in the outer court, and led them in to wash off the salt and the dust of the long journey. And presently, clad in fresh clothes, they were standing before the king in his great hall, where the fire burned on the raised hearth in the center, and the king's favorite hounds lay sprawled about his feet. "Welcome to you, strangers," said Menelaus. "Tell me now who you are and where you come from, and what brings you to my hall." "I am a king's son, Paris by name, from Troy, far across the sea," Paris told him. "And I come because the wish is on me to see distant places, and the fame of Menelaus has reached our shores, as a great king and a generous host to strangers." "Sit then and eat, for you must be way weary with such far traveling," said the king. And when they were seated, meat and fruit and wine in golden cups were brought in and set before them. And while they ate and talked with their host, telling the adventures of their journey, Helen the queen came in from the women's quarters, 2 of her maidens following, one carrying her baby daughter, one carrying her ivory spindle and distaff laden with wool of the deepest violet color. And she sat down on the far side of the fire, the women's side, and began to spin. And as she spun, she listened to the stranger's tales of his journeying. And in little snatched glances, their eyes went to each other through the fronding hearth smoke. And Paris saw that Menelaus's queen was fairer even than the stories told, golden as a cornstalk, and sweet as wild honey. And Helen saw, above all things, that the stranger prince was young. Menelaus had been her father's choice, not hers, and though their marriage was happy enough, he was much older than she was, with the first gray hairs already in his beard. There was no gray in the gold of Paris's beard, and his eyes were bright, and there was laughter at the corners of his mouth. Her heart quickened as she looked at him, and once, still spinning, she snapped the violet thread.
So King Menelaus invited Paris and his men in to have dinner with him. Meanwhile, these two over here, Helen and Paris, are making hard eyes at each other the whole time.
For many days Paris and his companions remained the guests of King Menelaus, and soon it was not enough for Paris to look at the queen. Poor Oenone was quite forgotten, and he did not know how to go away, leaving Helen of the fair cheeks behind. So the days went by, and the prince and the queen walked together through the cool olive gardens and under the white-flowered almond trees of the palace, and he sat at her feet while she spun her violet wool and sang her the songs of his own people. And then one day the king rode out hunting. Paris made an excuse not to ride with him, and he and his companions remained behind. And when they were alone together, walking in the silvery shade of the olives while his companions and her maidens amused themselves at a little distance, Paris told the queen that it was for sight of her that he had come so far, and that now he had seen her, he loved her to his heart's core, and could not live without her. "You should not have told me this," said Helen, "for I am another man's wife, and because you have told me it will be the worse for me when you go away and must leave me behind." "Honey sweet," said Paris, "my ship is in the bay. Come with me now, while the king, your husband, is away from home. For we belong together, you and I, like two slips of a vine sprung from the same stock." And they talked together, on and on through the hot noontide, with the crickets chirring, he urging and she holding back. But he was Paris, who always got the things he wanted, and deep within her, her heart wanted the same thing. And in the end she left her lord and her babe and her honor, and followed by his companions, with the maidens wailing and pleading behind them, he led her down the mountain paths and through the passes to his ship waiting on the seashore. So Paris had the bride that Aphrodite had promised him, and from that came all the sorrows that followed.
So Paris was a wife snatcher, and as the book said, from that came all the sorrows that followed.
Ship gathering. When Menelaus returned from hunting and found his queen fled with the Trojan prince, the black grief and the red rage came upon him, and he sent word of the wrong done to him, and a furious call for aid to his brother, black-bearded Agamemnon, who was high king over all the other kings of Greece. And from golden Mycenae of the Lion Gate, where Agamemnon sat in his great hall, the call went out for men and ships. To ancient Nestor of Pylos, to Thisbe, where the wild doves croon, to rocky Pytho, to Ajax the mighty, lord of Salamis and Diomedes of the loud war cry, whose land was Argos of the many horses, to the cunning Odysseus among the harsh hills of Ithaca, even far south to Idomeneus of Crete, and many more. And from Crete and Argos and Ithaca, from the mainland and the islands, the black ships put to sea, as the kings gathered their men from the fields and the fishing, and took up bows and spears for the keeping of their oath, to fetch back Helen of the fair cheeks, and take vengeance upon Troy, whose prince had carried her away. Agamemnon waited for them with his own ships in the harbor of Aulis, and when they had gathered to him there, the great fleet sailed for Troy. But one of the war leaders who should have been with them was lacking, and this was the way of it. Before ever Paris was born, Thetis of the silver feet had given a son to King Peleus, and they called him Achilles. The gods had promised that if she dipped the babe in the Styx, which is one of the rivers of the underworld, the sacred water would proof him against death in battle. So, gladly she did as she was bidden, but dipping him head first in the dark and bitter flood, she held on to him by one foot. Thus her fingers, pressed about his heel, kept the waters from reaching that one spot. By the time she understood what she had done, it was too late, for the thing could not be done again. So ever after she was afraid for her son, always afraid. When he was old enough, his father sent him to Thessaly with an older boy, Patroclus, for his companion, to Chiron, the wisest of all the centaurs. And with the other boy, Chiron taught him to ride on his own back, and trained him in all the warrior skills of sword and spear and bow, and in making the music of the lyre, until the time came for him to return to his father's court.
So King Menelaus was angry because his wife got snatched. So he was like, I'm going to call my brother Agamemnon. And they were like, yeah, let's go to war. Let's go destroy Troy. He snatched my wife. Let's kill them all. And then we get this backstory about Achilles, who has a weakness in his Achilles tendons from where his mom dipped him in the river to keep him safe from being injured, but she kind of failed.
But when the High King's summons went out and the black ships were launched for war, his mother sent him secretly to the Isle of Skyros, begging King Lycomedes to have him dressed as a maiden and hidden among his own daughters, so that he might be safe. How it came about that Achilles agreed to this, no one knows. Maybe she cast some kind of spell on him, for love's sake. But there he remained among the princesses, while the ships gathered in the world outside. But Thetis' loving plan failed after all, for, following the seaways eastward, part of the fleet put in to take on fresh water at Skyros, where the whisper was abroad that Prince Achilles was concealed. King Lycomedes welcomed the warriors, but denied all knowledge of the young prince. The leaders were desperate to find him, for Calchas, chief among the soothsayers who sailed with them, had said that they would not take Troy without him. Then Odysseus, who was not called the resourceful for nothing, blackened his beard and eyebrows, and put on the dress of a trader, turning his hair up under a seaman's red cap, and with a staff in one hand and a huge pack on his back, went up to the palace. When the girls heard that there was a traitor in the palace forecourt, out from the women's quarters they all came running, Achilles among them, veiled like the rest, to see him undo his pack. And when he had done so, each of them chose what she liked best: a wreath of gold, a necklace of amber, a pair of turquoise earrings blue as the sky, a skirt of embroidered scarlet silk, until they came to the bottom of the pack. And at the bottom of the pack lay a great sword of bronze, the hilt studded with golden nails. Then the last of the girls, still closely veiled, who had held back as though waiting all the while, swooped forward and caught it up, as one well used to the handling of such weapons. And at the familiar feel of it, the spell that his mother had set upon him dissolved away. "This is for me," said Prince Achilles, pulling off his veil. Then the kings and chieftains of the fleet greeted and rejoiced over him. They stripped off his girls' garments, and dressed him in kilt and cloak, as befitted a warrior, with his new sword slung at his side. And they sent him back to his father's court, to claim the ships and the fighting men that were his by right, that he might add them to the fleet. His mother wept over him, saying, "I had hoped to keep you safe for the love I bear you, but now it must be for you to choose. If you bide here with me, you shall live long and happy. If you go forth now with the fighting men, you will make for yourself a name that shall last while men tell stories round the fire, even to the ending of the world. But you will not live to see the first gray hair in your beard, and you will come home no more to your father's hall." "Short life and long fame for me," said Achilles, fingering his sword. So his father gave him 50 ships, fully manned, and Patroclus to go with him for his friend and sword companion. And his mother, weeping still, armed him in his father's armor, glorious war gear that Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, had made for him. And he sailed to join the black ships on their way to Troy.
So Achilles' mom knew that she had failed, and she tried to keep him safe by putting a spell on him and disguising him as a girl. But then when Odysseus came in with his bag full of goodies, he found the sword and he was like, "Wait a minute, this sword is for me, I must go to battle."
Quarrel with the High King. The Greeks did not have smooth sailing. Storms beat them this way and that, and more than once they met with enemy fleets and had to fight them off. But at last they came in sight of the coast below Troy city. Then they made a race of it, the rowers quickening the oar beat, thrusting their ships through the water, each eager to come first to land. The race was won by the ship of Prince Pertesalas, but as the prince sprang ashore, an arrow from among the defenders took him in the throat, and he dropped just above the tide line, the first of the Greeks to come ashore, the first man to die in the long war for Troy. The rest followed him, and quickly drove back the Trojan warriors, who were ill prepared for so great an enemy war host. And when that day's sun went down, they were masters of the coastwise dunes, and reed beds, and rough grass that fringed the great plain of Troy. They beached their ships, and built halls and huts in front of them to live in, so that in a while there was something like a seaport town. And in that town of turf and timber they lived while year after year of war went by. 9 times the wild almonds flowered and fruited on the rocky slopes below the city. 9 times summer dried out the tamarisk scrub among the grave mounds of long-dead kings. The ship's timbers rotted, and the high, fierce hopes that the Greeks had brought with them grew weary and dull-edged. They knew little of siege warfare. They did not seek to dig trenches round the city, nor to keep watch on the roads by which supplies and fighting men of allied countries might come in. Nor did they try to break down the gates or scale the high walls. And the Trojans, ruled by an old king and a council of old men, remained for the most part within their city walls, or came out to skirmish only a little way outside them, though Hector, their war leader and foremost among the king's sons, would have attacked and stormed the Greek camp if he had had his will. But there were other lesser cities along the coast that were easier prey, and the men of the black ships raided these and drove off their cattle for food, and their horses for the chariots that they had built, and the fairest of their women for slaves. On one of these raids far down the coast, when the almond trees were coming into flower for the 10th time, they captured and brought back 2 beautiful maidens, Chryseis and Briseis, among the spoils of war. Chryseis was given to Agamemnon, who as high king always received the richest of the plunder, while Briseis was awarded to Achilles, who had led the raid.
So they set up little villages all along the shores of Troy, and they fought for 9 long years. Around year 10, they overtook another small village and took 2 girls named Chryseis and Briseis for King Agamemnon and Achilles.
Chryseis' father, who was a priest of Apollo, the sun god, followed and came to the Greek camp, begging for his daughter back again, and offering much gold for her ransom. But Agamemnon refused, and bade the old man be gone, with cruel insults. And there it seemed that the thing was ended. But soon after, fever came upon the Greek camp. Many died, and the smoke of the death fires hung day and night along the shore. And in despair, the Greeks begged the soothsayer Calchas to tell them the cause of the evil. And Calchas watched the flight of birds and made patterns in the sand, and told them that Apollo, angry on behalf of his priest, was shooting arrows of pestilence into the camp from his silver bow, and that his anger would not be cooled until the maiden Chryseis was returned to her father. On hearing this, Agamemnon fell into a great rage, and though the other leaders urged him to release the girl, he swore that if he did so, then he would have Briseis out from Achilles' hall in her place. Then Achilles, who had grown to care for Briseis, would have drawn his sword to fight for her. But gray-eyed Athene, who was for the Greeks because Aphrodite was for Paris and the Trojans, put it into his mind that no man might fight the high king, and that all manner of evils, from defeat in battle to bad harvests, would come of it if he did. Even so, a bitter quarrel flared between them, though wise old Nestor tried to make peace. Achilles, who despite his youth was the proudest and hottest-hearted of all the Greek leaders, called Agamemnon a greedy coward with the face of a dog and the heart of a deer. It is small part you play in the fighting, but you take other men's prizes from them when the fighting is over, robbing them of the reward and the honor that is rightfully theirs, for this one reason, that you have the power to do it, because you are the high king. I am the high king, agreed Agamemnon, his face blackening as though a storm cloud gathered over it. I have the power, even as you say, and let you not forget it. Also, as high king, I have the right, and let you not forget that either, you who are no more than a prince among other princes. The quarrel roared on, despite all that the other leaders could do to stop it. And in the end, it was Achilles who had the final word. Lord Agamemnon, you have dishonored me, and therefore now I swear on all the gods that I will fight for you no more. Nor will I take any part in this struggle against Troy until my honor is made good to me again. And he strode out from the council gathering and went back to his own part of the camp, his own hall and his own black ships, and all the men of his own country with him. Then Agamemnon, in a black and silent rage, caused Chryseis to be put into one of his ships, and cattle with her for a sacrifice to Apollo, and ordered Odysseus to take command of the ship and return the girl to her father. And as soon as the ship had sailed, he sent his heralds to fetch Briseis from Achilles' hall and bring her to his own. Achilles made no more attempt to resist, and stood by as though turned to stone while the girl was led weeping away. But when she was gone, he went down to the cold seashore and flung himself down upon the tide line and wept his heart away. And his mother, Thetis of the silver feet, heard the voice of his furious grief from her home in the crystal palaces of the sea. And she came up through the waters like a sea mist rising, no one seeing her except her son.
So Chryseis' dad wanted her back, and he cast a spell on all of the Greeks, and that made them all really, really sick. So Agamemnon was like, fine, if you take Chryseis back, then I'm going to take Briseis from Achilles. And Achilles was really mad because he came to care for Briseis. So him and Agamemnon got in a fight, and they decided that they weren't going to be on each other's side anymore.
And she sat down beside him and stroked his hair and his bowed shoulders, and said, "What bitter grief is this? Tell me the darkness that is in your heart." So, chokingly, Achilles told her what she asked, and in his grief and bitter fury he demanded that she go to Zeus the Thunderer, chief of all the gods, and pray him for a Trojan victory that should make the High King feel the loss of his greatest captain, and do him honor and beg for his return. Thetis promised that she would do as he asked, but it could not be done at once, for the father of the gods was absent about some matter in the farmost part of his world, and it must wait for his return to Olympus. So for 12 days Achilles remained by his ships, waiting and brooding on his wrongs. And Odysseus, having returned Chryseis to her father with the proper sacrifices and prayers and purification, came again to the ship strand with the promise that Apollo was no longer set against them and had lifted the plague curse away. But still Briseis wept in the hall of the High King, and Achilles sat among his ships, nursing his anger as though it were a red rose in his breast.